Gdańsk shipyard, gate number 2. August 14th, 1980, 6:00 a.m. The Baltic dawn is a pale metallic grey. The scent of sea salt and industrial rust hangs in the damp air. The monumental cranes of the Lenin shipyard stand frozen against the skyline, silent for the first time in memory. Before the gates, a crowd gathers, not the usual chaotic shift change of thousands, but a quiet, deliberate assembly. Men in worn work jackets, their faces etched with the grit of welding fumes and political fatigue. Women from the nearby tram depot stand with them. At the centre, a short, mustachioed electrician climbs onto a makeshift platform. His name is Lech Wałęsa. He is a man previously fired, blacklisted and monitored. He holds no weapon. His tool is a borrowed pen used to scratch demands on a wooden board, the reinstatement of a fired colleague, a raise in pay, the erection of a monument to workers shot dead by the regime a decade prior. A demand unthinkably for independent trade unions. Around them, the apparatus of control holds its breath. Militia vans idle in side streets. Plainclothes Służba Bezpieczeństwa, the SB, the Polish secret police, snap photographs from rooftops, their radios crackling with coded alerts to Warsaw and, inevitably, to Moscow. The KGB residentura at the Soviet embassy is on high alert. Their manuals contain protocols for riots, for armed insurrection, but not for this. A disciplined, peaceful strike organised not by clandestine cells, but openly by crane operators and welders. The workers have not seized the yard by force, they have simply occupied it, refusing to work, refusing to leave. They have captured the means of production not with guns, but with their own physical presence. The levers of power, the threat of tanks, the network of informants, the ideology of total control find nothing to grip. The silence of the shipyard is louder than any protest chant. It is the sound of a crack forming in the foundation of an empire. Berlin 1945 to 1970. To understand the powerlessness of the KGB in August 1980, one must first understand the nature of its power in Poland. It was never absolute. Poland was the Soviet bloc's most rebellious satellite, a conquest that never fully accepted its chains. The post-war arrangement, carved at Yalta and cemented in blood, placed Poland firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence. Yet, from the very beginning, it was an unstable foundation. The Polish United Workers' Party, PZPR, was installed, its leadership vetted and often directly controlled by Moscow. The Soviet Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, a Pole by birth but a Soviet officer in Seoul, was appointed Poland's Minister of Defense, commanding a military answerable to the Kremlin. The true nervous system of control, however, was the security apparatus. The Ministry of Public Security, UB, and later the Służba Bezpieczeństwa, SB, were built in the precise image of the Soviet KGB and NKVD. They were tools of political terror, mass surveillance, arbitrary arrest, torture, and show trials eliminated wartime resistance groups like the Home Army. Their purpose was to atomize society, to breed fear and mutual suspicion, making collective action unthinkable. But Poland possessed a unique, resilient counterweight, the Roman Catholic Church. While elsewhere in the bloc churches were suppressed or turned into puppet institutions, in Poland the church remained a massive, independent moral and social authority. The 1966 celebrations of Poland's 1,000-year baptism were a national religious festival that dwarfed state-sponsored communist events. The church provided a parallel space for community, philosophy, and national identity that stood completely outside and openly challenged Marxist-Leninist dogma. It was a fortress the security services could surveil and harass, but never storm. When Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński was imprisoned in 1953, his stature only grew, and his release in 1956 was a tacit admission of the regime's limits. This volatile mixture produced repeated eruptions. The regime responded with the 10th Armoured Division of the Internal Security Corps, deploying tanks against protesters. Dozens were killed. The Poznan uprising was a shockwave, proving that the workers' state would slaughter workers to maintain power. For a moment, Moscow hesitated, its tanks mobilizing on the border, but Gomułka assured the Soviets of Poland's loyalty to the Warsaw Pact, and the moment passed. The lesson was internalized by both sides. The Polish people had a breaking point, and Moscow's ultimate weapon was armored intervention. For over a decade, a tense, repressive stability held. The SB perfected its methods. It maintained a vast network of informants, an estimated one informer for every 400 citizens by the 1970s. It infiltrated intellectual circles, monitored the clergy, and created a climate of pervasive, low-grade fear. The economy, centrally planned and inefficient, delivered a bare minimum standard of living, subsidized by Soviet resources. But the fundamental contradictions were merely dormant. Poland was a nation where the official ideology was a foreign import, the economy was a failing artifice, and the soul of the nation resided in the very institution the state was sworn to eradicate. This brittle equilibrium was shattered in December 1970. Again, the trigger was economic, a sudden pre-Christmas announcement of drastic increases in the prices of basic foodstuffs. In the shipyards of Gdańsk, Gdynia and Szczecin, workers walked out. This time, the protests turned violent. Party buildings were burned. The response was swift and brutal. The Polish People's Army and police units opened fire on coastal workers. Officially, 45 people were killed. The true number was certainly higher. The images of bodies on the streets of Gdynia, of workers carrying a fallen comrade on a door used as a stretcher, the Gdynia Pieta, seared themselves into the national consciousness. The regime had once more shed Polish blood. The aftermath was critical. The blood debt of 1970 was never addressed, the perpetrators never punished. A deep, seething anger settled among the working class. They had learned that the state would shoot them, and the state had learned that shooting them came at a high political cost. A silent, unspoken border had been drawn. The next confrontation would require a new calculus from both the workers in the yards and the men in the Politburo, watching uneasily from Warsaw and Moscow. Economic collapse and the rise of dissent, 1970-1980. Edward Gierek's decade began with a borrowed illusion. Flush with hard currency loans from Western banks, eager to modernize Poland and buy social peace, he embarked on a reckless spending spree. Factories were built with imported technology, consumer goods flooded shops. For a few years, the Polish economic miracle seemed real, but it was a phantom built on a mountain of debt, over $20 billion owed to the West by the late 1970s, and dependent on a global economic system Poland could not control. The 1973 oil shock sent ripples through the fragile planned economy. Inefficient state industries could not produce export goods of sufficient quality to service the debt. The cycle of borrowing to repay previous loans began. By 1976, the facade crumbled. On June 24th, Gierek's government announced sudden, steep price increases for basic commodities. Sugar by 100%, meat by 69%. The response was immediate and nationwide. In the industrial town of Radom, workers from the Walter Metal factory poured into the streets, eventually burning the local party committee headquarters. In Ursus, near Warsaw, tractor factory workers blocked the strategic railway line linking Warsaw to Berlin. The regime, remembering 1970, did not immediately order troops to fire. Instead, the militia and Zomo special police units were unleashed in vicious post-protest pacifications. Thousands were arrested, brutally beaten, and summarily fired from their jobs. The Radom and Ursus protests were put down, but they birthed something new and transformative. An alliance. A group of intellectuals from Warsaw, journalists, academics, lawyers, horrified by the state's brutality, organized to provide legal, financial, and medical aid to the persecuted workers. They formed the Workers' Defense Committee, known by its Polish initials KOR. This was a seismic shift. The traditional communist playbook aimed to keep the intelligentsia and the working class divided, blaming each for the country's ills. KOR, led by figures like Jacek Kuron and Antoni Macierewicz, consciously bridged that gap. They published newsletters like Robotnik, The Worker, detailing the regime's abuses and circulating practical advice on organizing. They operated openly, signing their names to public declarations, daring the SB to arrest them and reveal the regime's intolerance of any humanitarian act. KOR was not alone. The Catholic Church, under the new Polish Pope John Paul II, elected in 1978, found a powerful global voice. His papal visit to Poland in June 1979 was a 9-day national catharsis. Millions attended his open-air masses, not as religious subjects, but as a sovereign people expressing their identity. The state was rendered a spectator. and his evocation of Poland's Christian history directly undermined the regime's legitimacy. The SB recorded everything, amassing miles of film and audio tape, utterly powerless to stop the emotional and psychological mobilization of a nation. Simultaneously, a technological revolution was undermining state control of information. The proliferation of cheap, durable duplicating machines, mimeographs, and later primitive offset presses meant that the state's monopoly on the printed word was over. Samizdat, or drugi obieg, second circulation, flourished. Books, newspapers, and political analyses banned by the censors circulated hand-to-hand in thousands of copies. The Flying University held clandestine lectures in private apartments. This was not a guerrilla army stockpiling guns, but a society stockpiling ideas, creating a parallel information network the SB could raid but could not silence. By 1979, Poland was a pressure cooker. The foreign debt was unsustainable. Shop shelves grew emptier. Ration cards for meat and sugar were reintroduced, a humiliating symbol of failure. The regime's authority was a hollow shell, preserved only by the latent threat of Soviet intervention and the public's traumatic memory of 1956, 1970, and 1976. The working class was angry, organized by underground bulletins, and morally supported by the church and the intelligentsia. The security apparatus was omnipresent, but it was now chasing shadows that multiplied faster than they could be arrested. The stage was set not for a coup nor an insurrection, but for a social phenomenon that would weaponize civil society itself. The spark would come, again, from the Baltic coast, where the memory of 1970s blood had fermented for a decade into a resolve that would not be broken by batons or lies. The power of solidarity was not born from a political manifesto, but from a fusion of three distinct human experiences within Polish society, each hardened by a decade of conflict with the state. First, the industrial worker. By 1980, he was not the idealized proletarian of communist propaganda. He was a skilled electrician in Gdansk, a crane operator in Szczecin, a miner in Silesia. His grievances were concrete: falling real wages, rising prices, endless queues for substandard meat. But his rebellion was also profoundly moral. The blood of 1970 had created a sacred debt. The demand for a monument to the fallen was not a negotiating point. It was a precondition for any dialogue, a public exhumation of the regime's original sin. Figures like Lech Wałęsa, Anna Walentinowicz, the fired crane operator whose dismissal triggered the strike, and Andrzej Gwiazda provided a leadership that was authentic, gruff, and untouchable by the usual tactics of co-option or blackmail. They spoke the language of the shipyard, not the party committee. The SB's vast files on anti-socialist elements were useless here. These were not clandestine conspirators. They were the very workforce the state claimed to represent, standing in the open, demanding their rights as workers. To criminalize them was to criminalize the entire productive base of the nation. Second, the intellectual activist. For members of KOR and later the Solidarity advisory experts like Bronisław Geremek and Tadeusz Mazowiecki, the struggle was one of truth and law. They weaponized their education. They provided the strikers with legal counsel, drafting meticulous, watertight statutes for independent, self-governing trade unions that cited international labor conventions the Polish state had nominally signed. They turned the regime's own bureaucratic, legalistic language against it. Their tools were typewriters, carbon paper, and a relentless commitment to factual accuracy in documenting state violence. They formed a protective barrier around the workers, ensuring the movement's demands were articulated with a sophistication that made them difficult to dismiss as mere economic hooliganism. This alliance transformed a local strike into a national cause, providing the strategic depth and intellectual legitimacy the state could not match. Third, the Catholic priest. In parishes across Poland, but especially in port cities, the church provided the essential physical and moral sanctuary. Masses were held for the strikers. Priests like Father Henryk Jankowski at St. Bridget's Church in Gdansk acted as chaplains and intermediaries. The church's infrastructure, its parishes, its nationwide presence, its moral authority, became the skeleton of the movement. It offered a space for meeting and organizing that was, in the Polish context, politically untouchable. The regime could raid a private apartment. Storming a church to arrest a strike committee was a line even the Politburo feared to cross. The priest in his cassock, standing between the workers and the Zomo, was a symbol of a higher authority that the state's power could not supersede. Together, this trinity, the workers' moral anger, the intellectual's tactical precision, and the priest's spiritual sanctuary, created a social movement of unprecedented resilience. The KGB and SB were trained to deal with dissident individuals or clandestine cells. They had no operational manual for a society that had spontaneously, openly, and peacefully organized itself into a parallel nation. The information war that decided Poland's fate was fought with analog tools on one side and digital aspirations on the other. The battlefield was the public mind, and here the seemingly primitive technology of dissent proved more agile and potent than the state's monolithic control systems. Solidarity's nervous system was the bibua, the leaflet literature of the underground press. Using stencils and ink, it could produce thousands of readable, durable copies. It was mechanically simple, easy to hide, and required no centralized printing house. Workshops, parish basements, and private apartments became miniature publishing houses. The content ranged from strike bulletins and the latest negotiation updates from Gdansk to treatises on economics and history. The most powerful publication, the Solidarność Weekly, reached a peak circulation of 500,000 copies per issue, a number that rivaled official newspapers. This network was decentralized and robust. The SB could raid one apartment and seize one machine, only for two more to appear elsewhere. The information flowed along human networks, friends, co-workers, parishioners, that the security services could never fully map or sever. Complementing the mimeograph was the shortwave radio. S-Congress and broadcast from Munich became the national bulletin board. News from inside Poland, smuggled out via courier or telephone, would be broadcast back in Polish hours later, authenticated and contextualized. A worker in Katowice could learn the details of a strike in Szczecin, creating a sense of national unity and real-time solidarity that broke the regime's information blockade. The state could jam the signals, but dedicated listeners would find the frequencies, often at great personal risk. Conversely, the state's technological advantage was staggering, yet ultimately brittle. The SB and KGB possessed mainframe computers for data collation, vast archives of wiretap recordings, networks of hidden cameras, and sophisticated printing presses for propaganda. Their power was centralized and hierarchical. They monitored the output of the system, the telephones, the mail, public gatherings, but they could not comprehend or infiltrate the process. They could record a conversation between KOR members, but they could not stop the thousand-fold multiplication of a flyer detailing that conversation's conclusions. They were masters of a top-down, command-and-control information model, facing a bottom-up, viral, peer-to-peer network. The regime's censorship office, Główny Urząd Kontroli Prasy, Publikacji I Widowisk, employed thousands to scrutinize every word published. Yet by 1980, its work was absurd. It could blue pencil an article in an official newspaper, but it could not touch the torrent of uncensored truth flowing from the duplicators. The state's technology was about restriction. The opposition's technology was about reproduction. In that contest, reproduction proved infinitely more powerful. The sheer physical volume of forbidden text, passed hand to hand, read aloud in factories, tucked into prayer books, created an alternative reality that first matched and then overwhelmed the official one. The regime's monopoly on truth was not just broken, it was rendered obsolete by the whirring drum of a simple duplicating machine in a basement. The clash between solidarity and the state was a duel of leadership philosophies, one organic and improvisational, the other rigid and doctrinaire. On one side stood Lech Wałęsa and his Interfactory Strike Committee, MKS. On the other, the Polish Politburo, and looming behind them, the Soviet leadership. Wałęsa's authority was not bestowed by any institution. It was earned in real time at the Gdańsk shipyard gate. His leadership style was visceral, intuitive, and theatrical. He understood the psychology of the crowd and the cameras. With his distinctive moustache, work jacket, and the ever-present image of the Black Madonna of Częstochowa pinned to his lapel, he was a symbol crafted for the media age. More crucially, he possessed an unerring instinct for the politically possible. He consistently pushed the regime to its limit, but stopped short of the single provocation that would justify a Soviet invasion, a general strike across the entire country, or a direct assault on party rule. He channeled the workers' raw power into disciplined sit-down strikes and meticulously negotiated agreements. His famous refrain, "Nie chcę, ale muszę," I don't want to, but I have to, spoken while signing the Gdańsk Accords, captured his role as both a revolutionary leader and a pragmatic negotiator holding his own radical base in check to achieve a tangible victory. Surrounding him was a brain trust of intellectuals like Jeremek and Mazowiecki, who provided the strategic foresight he lacked. This symbiotic relationship allowed Solidarity to function as both a mass movement and a sophisticated political entity. Its structure was federal and democratic, a stark contrast to the rigid top-down hierarchy of the party. This made it incredibly difficult to decapitate. Arresting Wałęsa would have made him a martyr and sparked an uncontrollable fire. The movement had thousands of elected leaders in factories across the nation. Facing them was a Polish United Workers' Party leadership in a state of paralysis. First Secretary Stanisław Kania and later General Wojciech Jaruzelski were trapped in a triangulation between Moscow's demands for a firm hand, the Polish populace's explosive demands, and the crumbling reliability of the Polish army and party itself. They operated from a Soviet-authored playbook: isolate the extremists, offer minor concessions, split the movement, and if all else failed, use force. But every page of that playbook failed. Concessions only strengthened Solidarity's legitimacy. Attempts to paint Wałęsa as a radical were undone by his own pragmatic public statements. The tool of force was blunted by the memory of 1970 and the knowledge that Polish soldiers might refuse to fire on Polish workers. The party's leadership was reactive, constantly lagging behind events, issuing threats it was increasingly afraid to execute. Their authority derived solely from the threat of Soviet tanks, a power that was ultimate but, if used, would annihilate any last vestige of their national legitimacy. The Polish crisis was not contained within its borders. It became a central front of the late Cold War, where external actors wielded influence with vastly different tools. The role of the United States, primarily through the CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy, was one of strategic enablement, not direct control. American policy, under both Carter and Reagan, was carefully calibrated to bolster the opposition without providing a casus belli for Soviet intervention. Funding, estimated in the millions of dollars annually, flowed through covert channels and ostensibly private foundations. It paid for printing presses, fax machines, typewriters, and medical supplies. It supported the publication and smuggling of books. It funded the émigré apparatus that supported Radio Free Europe. This aid was crucial. It provided the material backbone for the BBUA network, allowing it to achieve professional scale and reach. However, it did not direct Solidarity's strategy. The Americans were supplying the ammunition for an information war whose battles were planned and fought entirely by Poles. A far more profound external influence was the Vatican under Pope John Paul II. This was not financial, but spiritual, moral, and geopolitical. The Pope provided an unimpeachable ideological counterweight to Marxism-Leninism. His sermons and encyclicals emphasizing human dignity and the rights of conscience provided the philosophical underpinning for the resistance. Diplomatically, the Vatican acted as a quiet channel, urging restraint on both sides. The Pope's very existence transformed the Polish Church from a national institution into a node in a global network of moral authority, shielding the opposition with a form of spiritual sovereignty that Moscow dared not violate directly. The Soviet response, orchestrated by the KGB and the Politburo, was one of escalating frustration and strategic impotence. Through the Warsaw Pact, they maintained relentless military pressure. Massive exercises like Soyuz 81 in the spring of 1981 were transparent rehearsals for invasion. Politically, they demanded the Polish leadership restore order, sending a series of threatening letters. The KGB's active measures sought to discredit Solidarity, fabricating evidence linking it to Western intelligence and former Nazis. But these traditional tools of Soviet hegemony failed. Military invasion risked a global confrontation and a potential bloody insurgency in Poland that would shatter the Eastern Bloc's remaining cohesion. Their Polish proxies in the PZPR were losing control daily. Their propaganda was ignored by a population that trusted its own underground sources. The KGB, an agency built on secrecy, surveillance, and coercion, found itself powerless against a 10 million strong, open civilian movement that operated in plain sight. They could monitor its every meeting, but they could not comprehend or counter its essential nature. The blunt instrument of totalitarian power met the unbreakable fluidity of a national awakening. December 12th, 13th, 1981. Midnight, December 12th, 1981. A deep, frozen silence blankets Warsaw. The Politburo has been in session for hours. Outside, the city is oblivious. The delegates disperse, travelling home by train. Lech Wałęsa is asleep in his Gdańsk apartment. In a secure military communications centre, a pre-recorded address is cued. Troop movements planned for months under the veil of autumn Warsaw Pact exercises click into their final positions. Tanks and armoured personnel carriers, their markings obscured, rumble out of barracks and take up positions at key intersections, outside television and radio transmitters, power plants, and the offices of Solidarity's regional headquarters. They are not Soviet T-72s, but Polish T-55s and PT-76s. This is a critical, deliberate choice. At 6 o'clock a.m. on December 13th, all telephone lines in the country go dead. Radio and television broadcasts dissolve into static, then return with a single image, the stern, bespectacled face of General Wojciech Jaruzelski, dressed in full military uniform against a backdrop of the Polish eagle without the communist crown. He speaks in a cold, emotionless monotone. Today, at midnight, the Military Council of National Salvation was formed. A state of war has been introduced across the country. I address you as a soldier and as the head of the Polish government. Martial law, stan wojenny, is in force. The constitution is suspended. All civilian authority is transferred to the military. All public gatherings are banned. A curfew is imposed from 7 o'clock p.m. to 6 o'clock a.m. All borders, airports and harbours are sealed. The ZOMO special police units, now operating under military command and armed with live ammunition, fan out with lists provided by the SB. Their target? The entire leadership structure of Solidarity, KOR and associated intellectual groups. The arrests are swift, surgical, and nationwide. In Gdańsk, ZOMO units batter down Wałęsa's door before dawn, taking him into custody. He is flown to a government hunting lodge outside Warsaw, isolated and cut off. Across the country, the same scene plays out. Security forces pound on doors in the darkness, pulling men from their beds. Trucks and prison vans fill with the movement's leadership. Activists, advisors, printers, sympathetic academics. They are taken to internment camps, often hastily repurposed prisons or remote, freezing facilities like Białowieża or Strzebielinek. By the end of the day, over 3,000 of an eventual 10,000 internees are in custody. The aim is not public trial, but administrative detention, to decapitate and demoralize in one silent, brutal stroke. Simultaneously, the military seizes control of all media. Television and radio now broadcast only the communiques of the WRON, the Military Council of National Salvation, whose acronym coincidentally meant the Crow, a symbol of death in Polish folklore. Newspapers are placed under military censors. The goal is absolute information control, to create a national blackout, to make Solidarity disappear from public life as if it had never existed, and to plunge the population into a state of shocked disorientation. The operation, codenamed Operation Azalea by the Soviets, who were informed but not involved in the tactical execution, is a masterpiece of police-state logistics. It is the antithesis of the chaotic, open energy of the shipyard strikes. It is order imposed by dread, movement stifled by checkpoints, voice supplanted by the military bulletin. For the first time in 16 months, the streets belong not to the people but to the armoured personnel carriers and the silent, faceless soldiers within them. Dawn on December 13th revealed a country transformed into an occupied territory by its own government. Tanks squatted at city crossroads, soldiers in winter camouflage, their faces unreadable, checked documents under grey skies. The ubiquitous red and white Solidarity banners and graffiti were gone, scrubbed away by work details in the night. The public space, so vibrantly claimed by the movement, was now a sterile, controlled zone. But the regime's surgical strike had not killed the organism, it had driven it deeper into the national body. The first and most immediate form of resistance was the spontaneous strike. As workers arrived at factories, mines, and shipyards to find their leaders arrested and military commissars in charge, they sat down. The great Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, the birthplace of Solidarity, went idle. The Piast coal mine in Silesia was occupied underground, with miners vowing to stay until their colleagues were freed. These were not the organised, negotiated strikes of 1980. They were acts of defiance against the military junta, desperate and dangerous. The regime's response was calibrated to crush them without creating new martyrs. At the Wujek coal mine in Katowice on December the 16th, the situation escalated. ZOMO units facing a determined occupation used water cannons, tear gas, and then, fatally, live ammunition. 9 miners were shot dead. The sound of those gunshots echoed across Poland, a grim reminder that the rules had changed. The state of war was not a metaphor. The blood at Wujek forced a grim recalibration on both sides. The regime demonstrated its ultimate willingness to kill, but the political cost was immense, fracturing even the military's unity. For the resistance, it proved that open confrontation was suicidal. The struggle shifted forms. Solidarity did not die, it atomized. Its structures, designed to be democratic and decentralized, now proved their ultimate resilience. With the national leadership interned, initiative passed to underground regional cells and ordinary citizens. This gave rise to the second and most potent form of resistance, the immediate resurrection of the independent press. Within days of the crackdown, new bibua began to circulate. Presses hidden in attics and basements, moved from apartment to apartment, started rolling again. Tygodnik Mazowsze, the main Solidarity bulletin for the Warsaw region, achieved a staggering circulation of over 80,000 copies per week. The content was vital: lists of the interned, instructions for civil disobedience, transcripts of Western radio broadcasts, and scathing political commentaries. The military's control of the airwaves was total, but it was meaningless against the rustle of paper passed hand to hand. The SB and military counterintelligence launched Operation Różaniec, Rosary, a nationwide hunt for underground printing equipment. They conducted thousands of apartment searches, often at night, using sensitive electronic equipment to detect the telltale magnetic signature of a printing press or the heat of duplicator motors. They found some, but for every machine seized, another took its place. The information war, which the state believed it had won on December the 13th, had reignited within a week. The third arena was the international response. Jaruzelski had calculated that by using Polish forces to impose order, he would preempt a Soviet invasion and thus retain some international credit. He was wrong. The West reacted with immediate condemnation. President Ronald Reagan imposed severe economic sanctions on Poland, including the revocation of most favored nation trading status, and extended sanctions to the Soviet Union itself, accusing it of masterminding the crackdown. These sanctions crippled Poland's already bankrupt economy. More importantly, the global image of solidarity, peaceful workers crushed by a general's boot, became a powerful propaganda weapon for the West. The Polish crisis was no longer an internal Warsaw Pact matter. It was a stark moral drama on the world stage, with Jaruzelski cast as the villain. By the end of January 1982, a brutal stalemate had set in. The regime controlled the streets, the borders, and the official media. It had broken the back of mass protests. But it did not control the homes, the churches, or the minds of the people. It had arrested the leaders, but it could not arrest the idea. Solidarity was now a ghost in the machinery of the state, an unseen presence felt in every whispered conversation, every clandestine leaflet, every defiant display of the V for Victory sign scratched onto a wall. The military had won the battle of order, but it was losing the war for legitimacy with every passing day of grim, silent repression. Solidarity's second life, 1982 to 1985. With the public square occupied by tanks and silence, Polish society turned inward. The years following martial law were not a period of defeat, but of metamorphosis. Solidarity, outlawed in October 1982, ceased to be a legal trade union and became a vast clandestine civic infrastructure, a state within a state, operating in the shadows of the failing official one. This underground society was sustained by 3 interconnected pillars. First, the clandestine press achieved a scale and professionalism unimaginable before 1981. It was no longer just flyers and bulletins. By the mid-1980s, over 400 independent periodicals were in regular circulation. They published not just news, but literature, history, economic analyses, and even comic books. Nauer, the independent publishing house, operated as a full-scale underground distributor, with warehouses, couriers, and a catalogue. People could order banned books by Czesław Miłosz or George Orwell as if from a legitimate bookstore. The technological arms race continued. Offset printers, hidden in soundproof basements, produced near-professional quality publications. The SB's successes in raids were temporary setbacks in an unwinnable war of attrition against the sheer volume of production. Second, the church's role as a sanctuary became absolute. Parish buildings were the one public space the regime could not permanently occupy. Here, underground publications were distributed from confessional booths. Here, masses for the homeland became silent protests. Priests acted as couriers and message boards. Perhaps most symbolically powerful, churches became the galleries for a defiant public art. Replicas of the Gdynia Pietà from 1970, sculptures of the Virgin Mary draped in a solidarity armband, and crosses commemorating the Wujek miners appeared in chapels across the country. The state could whitewash a wall, but it could not remove a crucifix from a church altar. This spiritual and physical space provided the oxygen that kept the underground alive. Third, a parallel cultural and educational system flourished. The Flying University evolved into a more structured network of underground seminars and lectures, often held in private apartments at great risk. Degrees and knowledge were conferred outside the state-controlled academia. Rock music became a potent vehicle of dissent. Bands like Perfect and Lady Pank, while sometimes allowed limited official release, had their truly political lyrics circulated on bootleg cassettes. The lyrics spoke of betrayal, winter, and waiting, a shared cultural code that united a generation. The regime's response was a grinding, exhausting campaign of pressure. Martial law was formally suspended in December 1982 and lifted in July 1983, but its mechanisms remained. The SB relied less on mass internment and more on targeted harassment, pervasive surveillance, and the weaponization of everyday life. Activists faced the constant threat of losing their jobs, their apartments, or their children's chances at university. They were followed, their phones tapped, their friends pressured to inform. The strategy was normalization, to drain the energy from resistance through 1,000 petty cuts, to make the cost of dissent so personally exhausting that society would simply give up and retreat into private life. But normalization failed. The economy, crippled by Western sanctions and systemic inefficiency, was in freefall. Hyperinflation rendered salaries meaningless. Basic goods vanished from shops, only to reappear on the black market at exorbitant prices. The regime's promise of stability and order had delivered only poverty and despair. The social contract, acquiescence in exchange for a basic standard of living, was irrevocably broken. The underground society, for all its hardships, offered something the state could not: dignity, truth, and a sense of shared purpose. By 1985, Poland was a nation living a double life. The public facade was one of resigned obedience under a grey, military-backed authority. The private reality was one of a vibrant, stubborn and waiting counterculture, its networks intact, its memory sharp, and its resolve hardened by years of twilight struggle. Gorbachev, the empty coffers, and the Round Table, 1985 and 1989. By 1985, the Polish regime was sustaining a paradox. It held a monopoly on legal, political, and coercive power, yet it was utterly bankrupt, financially, ideologically, and socially. Its survival depended on two unsustainable pillars: the perpetual threat of Soviet intervention and the sheer inertia of a population worn down by scarcity. In March 1985, a seismic shift in Moscow began to remove the first pillar. The rise of Mikhail Gorbachev, with his policies of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, sent a contradictory signal to Warsaw. For the Polish leadership, it was initially a relief. The pressure for a fraternal aid invasion evaporated. But it was also a terrifying unravelling of the ideological certainty that had underpinned their rule. Gorbachev's rhetoric of reform within socialism implicitly validated the critiques Solidarity had been making for years. By 1988, his clear statements that the Brezhnev Doctrine was dead, that the USSR would not use force to prop up its satellites, pulled the linchpin from the entire system of control. The Polish generals and party bosses were now truly on their own. The second pillar, economic inertia, collapsed under its own weight. A series of botched price reform referendums in 1987 only highlighted the regime's illegitimacy. By 1988, hyperinflation reached 60% per month. Wages were meaningless. The state could no longer fulfill its most basic paternalistic functions. This economic freefall sparked a new wave of strikes in April and August of 1988, centered again in the Lenin shipyard and the Nova Huta steelworks. These were not the hopeful, massive strikes of 1980. They were shorter, sharper, and fueled by raw desperation over prices. Crucially, the old demand, the re-legalization of solidarity, re-emerged as the central precondition for any talks. The regime, out of economic options and lacking its Soviet backstop, had no credible threat left. The security apparatus could still break up strikes, but it could not fix the economy. The country was ungovernable. Facing this terminal impasse, a faction within the regime, led by Interior Minister General Czesław Kiszczak, began secret exploratory talks with solidarity figures in the autumn of 1988. Lech Wałęsa, though still a private citizen with no official status, was the indispensable interlocutor. These covert meetings, held in a government villa in Magdalenka, were the first crack in the wall. They led to the formal televised spectacle of the Round Table Talks, which opened on February 6, 1989. The Round Table was not a victory ceremony. It was a negotiated surrender disguised as a negotiation. The communist side, believing itself still in control, aimed to co-opt solidarity into a share of responsibility for the failing economy while retaining the core levers of power. The solidarity side, led by a team of expert advisors including Geremek and Mazowiecki, approached it with strategic brilliance. They agreed to contest only 35% of the seats in the lower house, the Sejm, in upcoming elections, conceding a guaranteed majority to the party and its satellite factions. In return, they demanded the creation of a new, fully free-elected upper house, the Senate, and the restoration of the office of president, which they expected the party to win. Most importantly, they secured the re-legalization of solidarity as a trade union. The regime viewed these terms as a manageable compromise, a way to share blame, not power. They fatally misjudged the public mood. The elections of June 4, 1989 became a national plebiscite. Wherever solidarity candidates were allowed to run, they won in landslides. In the Senate, they took 99 of 100 seats. But the most devastating blow came in the reserved Sejm seats. In a profound humiliation, virtually every single nationally listed communist candidate failed to secure the required 50% of the vote, as voters crossed their names off the ballot en masse. The message was unequivocal: zero legitimacy. The mathematical trick the party had built into the Round Table Agreement now backfired catastrophically. They held a majority in the Sejm, but they were utterly discredited. They could not form a government without solidarity, and solidarity now held the moral and political authority of the nation. After tense weeks, the impossible happened. On August 24, 1989, the Sejm appointed Tadeusz Mazowiecki, a Catholic intellectual and longtime solidarity advisor, as Prime Minister of Poland. A non-communist government in the heart of the Warsaw Pact had taken power, not through revolution or invasion, but through an election the communists themselves had sanctioned. The KGB's control, built over 4 decades through fear, infiltration and force, had been dismantled not by guns, but by ballots and the unyielding will of a society it could never truly absorb. The fall of the Polish People's Republic was not a sudden collapse, but a prolonged, granular dissolution of power. It was the story of a sovereign society reasserting itself against a foreign-imposed system that commanded the heights of the state, but never the depths of the nation. The KGB and its Polish subsidiary, the SB, were engineered to combat enemies defined by secrecy. Spies, saboteurs, clandestine networks. Their architecture of control was vertical, rigid, and absolute. It presupposed a state that could monopolize all public space, all information, all collective action. Solidarity represented the antithesis of that model. It was horizontal, fluid, and open. Its strength was not in its clandestinity, but in its visibility. Not in its weapons, but in its moral claims. It did not seize broadcasting towers. It built 1,000 mimeograph machines. It did not infiltrate the Politburo. It occupied the moral high ground of the factory, the university, and the parish hall. The security apparatus could arrest its leaders, raid its print shops, and jam its radio signals, but it could not arrest the social trust, the shared narrative, or the cultural identity that flowed through those channels. The state's violence from Poznan 1956 to Wujek 1981 did not extinguish the resistance. It fossilized the memory of injustice into a permanent, unyielding resolve. This was a revolution of limits. The Polish people, with a tragic historical acuity, understood the red line that would trigger a Soviet invasion. Solidarity's genius was in operating millimeters from that line, demanding the impossible until, through sheer persistence and changing global currents, the impossible became inevitable. The movement's ultimate weapon was patience, the willingness to endure the long, grey grind of martial law and economic decay, knowing the regime's foundations were rotting faster than theirs. In the end, the Polish experience demonstrated that totalitarian control is a brittle fiction. It can command obedience, but it cannot command legitimacy. It can monitor communications, but it cannot monitor conscience. It can possess all the instruments of coercion, yet be powerless against a simple, collective act of refusal. The crack that began at Gate Number 2 in Gdańsk did not just run through the Warsaw Pact, it revealed the fundamental flaw in the entire imperial project, that while tanks can conquer territory, only people can sustain a nation. The victory of solidarity was not merely a political change, it was a profound validation of civil society itself, proving that when a people become the state within the state, the actual state has already lost.